The great hall of River Run was heavy with the scent of burning wood, roast meat, and damp stone. Lords of the Riverlands in the north gathered under the banners of the dire wolf, their voices rising in argument. At the head of the hall sat Robb Stark, the young wolf, his jaw tight with frustration. Catelyn Stark sat beside him, her gaze shifting warily between the lords. "The Freys expect a wedding," Lord Karstark muttered, his grizzled beard quivering. "We cannot afford to anger them." Roose Bolton, ever the calculating man, leaned forward. "Walder Frey's alliance is useful, yes, but there are other means to secure the North's future." It was then that Edmure Tully, weary from battle, set down his goblet. "There's been an offer," he said, his voice measured, "from King's Landing." Silence fell. The words King's Landing had become a curse among the Stark loyalists. Catelyn tensed, while Grey Wind, lying at Robb's feet, lifted his head with a soft growl. Edmure met his nephew's gaze. "An offer of peace. A marriage." Robb's brow furrowed. "Whose hand?" "Myrcella Baratheon." A murmur of shock rippled through the hall. Catelyn inhaled sharply, eyes flashing with skepticism. "A Lannister girl." Edmure nodded. "She's not like the rest of them. By all accounts, she's gentle. She's not Joffrey." Roose Bolton's pale eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Tywin Lannister is no fool. He would not send his granddaughter away unless he sought to secure peace." Lord Umber scoffed. "Peace? With the bastards who killed Lord Eddard?" Catelyn's voice was ice. "No peace with the Lannisters." But Robb sat still, deep in thought. The war had been long. They had won victories, but King's Landing still held the Iron Throne, and winter was coming. If he refused, they would have to fight until the end, with no guarantees. He looked to his mother. "Father made alliances through marriage. Perhaps this is not a trap. If we wed, we secure Myrcella as a hostage. If the Lannisters betray us, I'll have their princess." Catelyn's expression was stormy, but she did not argue. Lord Karstark growled, "And if it is a trick?" Robb's blue eyes hardened. "Then the Lannisters will learn what happens when they play games with wolves." The Raven arrived from King's Landing within a week. The terms were clear. Tywin Lannister offered Myrcella Baratheon's hand to Robb Stark in exchange for an end to hostilities between the North and the Crown. The offer was bold, unexpected, and dangerous. Catelyn remained wary. Tywin never gives without expecting something in return. This could be a trap. Robb, however, saw the opportunity for what it was. If he accepted, he gained not just a wife, but a potential bridge to the Iron Throne. Myrcella was young, barely 13, but she was known to be kind-hearted, unlike her monstrous brother. If he refused, he risked losing the war, running out of men, and facing the Frey's wrath for breaking his promise. The decision was made. They rode south under the direwolf banner, a host of northern and riverland soldiers accompanying Robb and his trusted lords. The Kingslayer was still their prisoner, a bargaining chip for negotiations. They would exchange Jaime for Myrcella, ensuring both sides played fairly. The meeting took place in the neutral lands of Harrenhal. Tywin Lannister, cold and unreadable, had sent emissaries in his place, but it was Cersei who arrived with Myrcella, her golden hair shining in the pale sunlight. "You are wise to accept," Cersei said coolly as she handed over her daughter. She glanced at Jaime, who stood bound between Stark guards. "This war has cost us much." Robb said nothing, studying Myrcella. She was quiet, her green eyes uncertain as she looked at him. Unlike her mother, she did not sneer or glare. If anything, she looked afraid. Jaime was released, and Myrcella was placed under the protection of the Northmen. The moment was tense, but the deal was done. Robb and Myrcella were to be wed within the moon's turn. That night, as they camped on the road back to River Run, Myrcella sat quietly in the tent she had been given. Catelyn Stark, ever protective, watched her carefully. "You have nothing to fear," Myrcella said suddenly, surprising Catelyn. "I am not my mother." Catelyn studied her. The girl was young, but there was a wisdom in her eyes, a quiet strength. "Then let us hope you are more like your father," Catelyn said, though she doubted it. Myrcella gave her a small, knowing smile. "Which one?" The words lingered in the air, unspoken truths that neither woman dared explore. The halls of River Run were adorned with banners of House Stark and House Baratheon. The direwolf and the crowned stag hung side by side, a sign of the uneasy peace forged through marriage. Robb Stark stood at the end of the hall, clad in black and gray, his shoulders squared, his face unreadable. At his side stood his mother, Catelyn, her expression cool as she watched the proceedings with wary eyes. Myrcella Baratheon was led forward by Lady Margaery Tyrell, who had been chosen as a neutral handmaiden for the occasion. The golden-haired princess wore a gown of Lannister crimson, but a direwolf sigil had been carefully stitched into the embroidery. It was a silent statement. She was no longer just a Lannister pawn. She was a Stark now. When Myrcella reached Robb, she looked up at him, her green eyes wide with uncertainty. He was so much taller, broader than she had expected. He was young, but he had the hardened look of a man who had seen war, who had lost too much. The ceremony was brief. The words were spoken, the hands bound, and the vows exchanged. "With this kiss, I pledge my love," Robb said, his voice steady but distant as he pressed his lips to Myrcella's in a formal kiss. The hall erupted into cheers, though many lords remained silent, their expressions mixed. Some, like Lord Karstark, still distrusted the match. Others, like Edmure Tully, saw the wisdom in it. After the feast, Robb and Myrcella were escorted to their chambers. The consummation of the marriage was expected, though no one would dare force the young princess. Robb dismissed the attendants, allowing them privacy. For a long moment they simply stood there, neither knowing what to say. "I know you did not want this marriage," Myrcella said softly, breaking the silence. Robb turned to her, his face unreadable. "No, but neither did you." She nodded, hesitating. "I will not be a burden to you." His gaze softened, just slightly. "You are not a burden." That night, they did not consummate the marriage. Instead, Robb sat beside the fire. Myrcella curled beneath the furs on the bed. The war had forced them into this, but neither of them knew what the future would hold. For now, they were allies. Whether they could ever be more remained to be seen. The days after the wedding were tense. Myrcella was no longer a Lannister, at least in name, but she was still seen as an outsider in the north. She walked the halls of Riverrun in silence, her golden hair a stark contrast to the dark-haired Stark bannerman who whispered behind her back. "She's still a lion," Lord Karstark muttered one evening as the northern lords gathered for council. "I don't trust her." "She's just a girl," Edmure Tully argued, "and she's the king's wife. Show some respect." Rose Bolton, ever calculating, studied Myrcella from his place near the fire. "She is young, yes, but she is also a key to power. Do not underestimate the influence she could have." Robb sat at the head of the table, listening to his bannermen debate his wife as if she were nothing more than a political piece. He clenched his jaw, his patience thinning. "She is my queen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and she will be treated as such." The room fell silent. Robb was still young, but his presence commanded respect. He had been forced to grow into leadership too soon, and though grief weighed on his shoulders, he had learned how to wield his authority well. That evening, as Robb returned to their shared chambers, he found Myrcella seated near the window, staring out at the river. She turned when she heard him enter. "They hate me," she said quietly. It was not a complaint, just a simple truth. Robb sighed, pulling off his cloak. "They don't know you." "They don't want to," she countered, her green eyes searching his face. "Even your mother." Robb hesitated. He couldn't deny it. Catelyn was cordial but distant, never truly acknowledging Myrcella as part of the family. The wounds of war, of Ned's execution, were still too fresh. "I can't force them to trust you," he admitted, stepping closer. "But you are my wife now, and I will not allow them to mistreat you." Myrcella studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I don't want to be just your wife in name," she said softly. "If we are to do this, if we are to rule together, I want to be your partner." Robb was taken aback by her boldness, but he saw no deceit in her eyes, only resolve. Perhaps she was more than just a Lannister pawn after all. Weeks passed, and Myrcella slowly learned the ways of the North. She walked the courtyards of Riverrun with Lady Catelyn, listening to the old stories of House Stark, of the kings in the north, of duty and honor. Though Catelyn remained wary, Myrcella never complained, never demanded comforts she no longer had. She was not her mother, nor her cruel brother, and though the northern lords whispered about her lion's blood, she made no effort to act like a Lannister. Still, she was alone. One afternoon, Myrcella visited the training grounds, where the northern men sparred under the watchful eye of Lord Umber. She stood near the fence, her golden hair catching the light, as Robb fought against Greatjun Umber's son, a broad-shouldered warrior nearly twice his size. Robb moved with skill, his blades swift and precise, but the fight was brutal. Every clash of swords sent sparks flying, every blow was met with a fierce counter. The Northerners cheered their young king, but Myrcella only saw the bruises forming on his arms, the strain in his muscles. When the fight ended with Robb forcing his opponent to yield, the men clapped him on the back, laughing, celebrating his strength. But Myrcella stepped forward with a frown. "You let yourself get hit too much," she said, crossing her arms. The laughter faded as the men turned to her, surprised by her boldness. Robb, panting, wiped the sweat from his brow and gave her an amused look. "Is that so?" he asked. "Yes," Myrcella said matter-of-factly. "You fight like a Northman, strong, honorable, but predictable. My Uncle Jaime—" She caught herself, realizing too late how the words sounded. The Northerners stiffened at the mention of the Kingslayer. Robb, however, only raised a brow. "Go on." She hesitated, then continued, choosing her words carefully. "My uncle always said that strength alone isn't enough. He was the best swordsman in Westeros because he thought 3 moves ahead. He fought with speed and precision, not just brute force." Robb tilted his head, intrigued. "And what would you suggest?" Myrcella smiled slightly. "You're quicker than most of them. Use it. Don't just block. Anticipate." Lord Umber let out a booming laugh. "The lioness has claws after all." Robb chuckled, sheathing his sword. "Perhaps you should train with us?" Myrcella smirked. "Perhaps I will." That evening, word of the exchange spread through the camp. The northern men still distrusted her, but there was a newfound respect. She was not just a fragile princess from the south. She was learning, adapting. Even Catelyn noticed. That night, as they sat in the Great Hall, she watched as Myrcella spoke quietly with Robb, discussing battle tactics, strategies, and the state of the war. "She is clever," Rose Bolton remarked, "and she's winning them over." Catelyn pursed her lips, watching her son's wife carefully. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was more Stark than Lannister after all. The uneasy peace between the North and the Crown Lands did not last long. Despite the marriage alliance, whispers of betrayal spread across Westeros like wildfire. Tywin Lannister had agreed to the marriage, but his patience was not infinite. He had not forgotten that Robb still held the Riverlands, nor had he forgiven the North for the humiliation they had inflicted upon House Lannister. When ravens arrived from the Westerlands, their message was clear. Tywin was gathering his armies once more. The supposed truce had merely been a means to buy time. Robb slammed his fist against the war table as he read the reports. "So much for peace," he muttered. The northern lords gathered in council. Lord Karstark, ever distrustful, sneered. "We should have never trusted the Lannisters. I said this was a trap." Rose Bolton, however, remained calm. "A trap, perhaps, but we still hold Myrcella. That gives us leverage." At the mention of her name, Myrcella, who had been standing near the hearth, felt the weight of every eye upon her. Some lords still viewed her as a pawn in the game, a hostage rather than a queen. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "If my grandfather is marching, then it is not for me," she said steadily. "If he still valued me as a true Lannister, he would not risk war." The cold truth settled over the room. Tywin Lannister, for all his cunning, was not a sentimental man. Myrcella had been cast aside, deemed expendable in the greater game. Robb looked at his wife. "Then we must prepare." That night, as they stood alone in their chambers, Myrcella finally voiced what had been weighing on her mind. "I don't belong to them anymore, do I?" Robb turned to her, his blue eyes searching. "You never did." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had always been a daughter of the Lannisters, a golden pawn in her family's ambitions. But now she was something else, something more, a Stark. But the war was far from over, and blood would soon stain the land once again. The North had prepared for war, but Tywin Lannister struck first. His army swept through the Riverlands with merciless precision, burning villages, executing rebel lords, and reclaiming territory lost in the early days of the war. With the phrase now back under Lannister influence, the South was tightening its grip. Ravens arrived daily with grim news. Riverrun was under siege. Edmure Tully held within its walls. The Lannisters had cut off supply routes, and the River Lords, once so eager to follow the young wolf, were beginning to waver. Robb stood over the war table, his fingers tracing the maps. His mother, Rose Bolton, Lord Karstark, and Myrcella stood beside him, all awaiting his decision. "We must break the siege," Catelyn urged. "Edmure will not hold forever." "We don't have the numbers for a direct assault," Rose Bolton countered, his expression cold. "Tywin has the advantage. If we charge blindly, we lose everything." Lord Karstark grumbled. "Then what do you suggest? Sit here and wait to starve?" Robb remained silent, deep in thought. Every move he made would determine the future of the North. He could not afford a mistake. It was Myrcella who spoke next. "Tywin fights like a Lannister," she said softly, but there was steel in her voice. "He fights with power, with gold, with overwhelming force. He expects you to meet him head-on because that is what an honorable Stark would do." Robb lifted his gaze to her. "And what would you suggest?" She stepped closer to the table, her delicate fingers resting on the map. "If you cannot win with numbers, you must win with strategy. Tywin's greatest weakness is his belief that he is invincible. Use that against him." Silence settled over the room. Rose Bolton's pale eyes gleamed with interest. Catelyn's face was unreadable. Robb studied his wife for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You're right." The next morning, orders were sent. The North would not march to Riverrun in a blind charge. Instead, Robb would draw Tywin's forces into a trap, leading them into the thick forests of the Riverlands, where the terrain would favor the North. For the first time, the young wolf and the golden rose planned a battle together, and Westeros would soon learn to fear them both. The Lannisters marched toward what they believed was the final battle to crush the North's rebellion. Tywin, ever confident in his strategy, led his forces through the Riverlands, expecting Robb Stark to challenge him on open ground. But Robb had no intention of fighting where Tywin wanted. The forests of the Riverlands were thick with mist, the ground damp and treacherous. The Lannister forces, weighed down by heavy armor and supply wagons, slowed as they passed through narrow roads and dense woodland. And then the wolves struck. Northern archers hidden in the trees rained arrows upon the golden-cloaked soldiers. Traps, concealed pits, and spiked barricades turned orderly ranks into chaos. The Lannisters, so accustomed to fighting in open fields, found themselves at the mercy of the North's guerrilla tactics. Robb rode at the front of his cavalry, his direwolf Grey Wind charging alongside him as they tore through enemy lines. The northern forces moved like ghosts, appearing from the shadows, striking swiftly, then vanishing before the Lannisters could regroup. At the heart of it all, Myrcella stood at Riverrun, commanding the defenses while Robb led the charge. Though she was no warrior, she had studied war under her grandfather and uncle. She sent ravens with precise orders, keeping the northern lords unified and preventing panic. For the first time, the River Lords looked at her not as a Lannister, but as their queen. After days of relentless ambushes, Tywin Lannister was forced to retreat, his forces bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The Battle of the Riverlands became a legend, the first time the young wolf outmaneuvered the greatest commander in Westeros. But the war was far from over. As Myrcella watched the ravens fly, a chill ran down her spine. She knew her grandfather well. Tywin Lannister never accepted defeat. He would strike back, and next time, he would not just come for the North. He would come for her.